Hello, everyone, and welcome to Feed Your Practice webinar Wednesdays for Arts Professionals, which is brought to you by The Place. My name is Christina, and I'm Head of Programming and Producing at The Place. I go by she, her pronouns. Today, I'm wearing a kind of khaki green cardigan, a white shirt. I'm a white woman in my early 40s, and I have brown bobbed hair. And I'm totally delighted to be joined by Neve Harrington today, who, amongst many other things, is currently Artist Associate at The Place, which is a new role that we have in the team here for a practicing artist. Today, Neve's webinar will look at imagining everybody in the audience as a partner, which I absolutely love the sound of. So I, like you, I'm sure, are keen to get started. But before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping information. So English captions are available. If you'd find those helpful, they're on the bottom or possibly the top of your Zoom window. As you may have noticed, we're joined by two BSL interpreters, Lauren and Caroline, who will be with us throughout and will be changing over every 15 minutes or so. And you should be able to pin them on your screen if you'd like to do that. And if you have any questions and comments, we really welcome those. So do get stuck in. You can ask a question or share a thought either as we go along or save it till the end of the session. And we're going to leave around 15 minutes at the end for questions and reflections. So do have a think about what you might want to ask Neve while she's talking. When it comes to asking your questions or sharing a comment, we have two ways to do this. If you're a BSL user and would like to ask a question using BSL, or you'd like to voice your question by speaking it out loud, then please use the raise hand function on Zoom. If you're not a BSL user or would rather type your question, please feel free to use the chat function. And my colleague Will, who is helping today, will be checking the chat as we go along and we'll be accumulating questions to go through at the end. So I think that's all the housekeeping. We've got until around 3 p.m. Today. And Neve, I'm going to hand over to you now to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Christina. So I am a white woman, just turned 40. I'm wearing a yellow hoodie. I've got kind of short, sort of slightly messy brown bobbed hair. And in the background, there are a few plants sort of peeking out from behind me. And yeah, I'm really happy to be sharing a little bit about my work today. What I've decided to do is to kind of free talk into the space. It's often a way that works a little bit better for me to sort of stay connected with sort of the liveness of the ideas of my work and how it meets maybe each of you in this moment. The subject, as Christina said, is imagining every audience in the partner, everybody in the audience as a partner or a partner. And so, yeah, there's something about sort of before we go, acknowledging that you guys are, in a sense, the audience and our partners in this conversation. So yeah, I really welcome like any questions that you might want to pop in the chat sort of as we go. I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of how I think about the works that I make, including how they meet audiences and some of the sort of underlying tenets of those relationships. But I'm really keen to be led also by your questions. So I'm going to kind of move through things. I'm going to give you probably quite a lot of information, and Christina's got some links that she's going to signpost to in the chat so that you can sort of follow up with more detail a little bit later in your own time. I'm also not going to share any video or audio, just so that we can keep kind of staying tethered to this present moment rather than sort of spending time watching things which are available online anyway. Great. So here we go. So this is a really busy screen. I know it's really busy. There's lots to read, but I'm kind of just wanted to share with you at the beginning something of a kind of a map or a web of some of the key words as I think about them as they relate to my practice. we're going to come back to these words kind of through the presentation as they relate to different works. But I thought what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit through what some of them mean for me. And hopefully for those of you who don't know me, that can situate my work in some ways. So in the very center, so I should say, first of all, the picture behind all these words is the stage design as it was being installed for my most recent work, which is called Sometimes. And we'll come to that at the very end of the presentation, but you can just sort of start to see some of the things that are maybe already going to pop up about the staging of work. This is a work that's in the round. You'll see there are these textile hangings, which I call red flags, which is also part of how I think about the performance work that I make, which is as a kind of a visual culture. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm an artist working with dance, working with installation, working with sometimes costume design, space design, creating works which are often in theatre and dance spaces, but which are also often in slightly less usual presentation formats, like in streets or outdoor spaces. I've made work across a bridge. I've made interactive performance, I've made books, I've made things for galleries. So we'll sort of touch through all of those. But what for me kind of brings everything together is this kind of word in the middle, which is is a combination of architecture and texture, which is, I think, currently how I'm thinking about everything I do, which is how are the spaces and everything that they contain, the design of the space, how an audience enters the space, how long the work is, how people are invited to stay or leave or come back. How is that kind of sensory architecture related to how what people already know before they enter the space and how the experience unfolds. So things that are important in my work are is also access and accessibility, which is kind of, it's over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and above that this abbreviation UX, which some of you might know, which stands for user design, and it's more a term that comes from kind of website design or coding spaces. But I think it's important in relation to my work, as we're going to trace through, about how audiences or participants, visitors, enter and move through spaces and how experiences unfold for them, whether that's in time or in space, or, as is usually the case, in both. And then at the top of the screen, kind of over, you've got like this dinosaur figure on one of the flags, and kind of above him, it says transparency, operations over time, liveness, modeling, repetition, maps and keys. And I'll talk again about these terms sort of as we go through the presentation. But for me, transparency is really something that's becoming really interesting to think about, in terms of through repetition, how does what happens in a space kind of reveal all of its many parts? How does a repetition in performance that I'm making allow people to perhaps deepen their encounter with something over time, sort of making an experience more and more available? So we'll kind of also come back to that, which relates to sort of familiarity. This will make a little bit more sense as we get going. And then over in the other corner, where we've got this flag that's got a kind of a U-turn sign, the words over there are parts, multi-partiality, taking things apart, and homeschooling. And I also want to share like a little bit about not only the work as it meets audiences, but also what my work and my practice means for me, which is that I've really come to think of my work a bit like a homeschool or homeschooling for me, to be a citizen, to flesh out the ways in which I want to act in and on the world, learning new skills, for example, sewing, costume making, meeting different communities or deepening relations with existing communities, and learning and understanding more through the kind of like funnel of a particular project. Which is, I don't have any other experience of homeschooling, but that's something that's kind of showing up kind of underneath, I'd say, my work for me, and I think often for and in the relationships that I have with audiences and participants and visitors. And then we'll go a little bit more into detail of the rest of these things, but then kind of in the bottom left side corner, underneath architectures, we've got the main event and fringes, learning and teaching, conversation, and intergenerational contact relationship. Which is also, we'll see through the work, something that I'm thinking about a lot is how is it possible to center exchange and conversation, dialogue, and different kinds of interfacing between audience and visitors in various kinds of work? So I won't say too much more about that now. I'm just going to skip forward, and we're going to come back to all of these as we go. Yeah, so before I get into the sort of the main event in a way of the presentation, and to say like a little bit more about my orientation to my work. So I started, I think, as a way, and actually I persist in my work as a way for me to live in the world and to understand. And so as much as I'm thinking about the audiences, visitors as partners, I'm also partnering with parts of myself and making things that help me to unpack, take apart, and understand certain dynamics, certain relationships. And so, yeah, I wanted to share this image with you. So we've got like a background image, which it's a banner that I made for myself in 2010 or 11. I can't remember, put the date. Yeah, 2010, yeah. You I think can see the full screen, but I've got like a band of some of your faces underneath. So, and this banner was no one gives a damn about what you don't do, was like a message to myself as I was at the very beginning of my journey as an artist. And it's something that sort of carries through a lot of my work. Like I'm interested in slogans and textile and protest and banner and messaging. And it's, yeah, I think I wanted to start this presentation with maybe sort of an honest sort of positioning of where I am in relation to my work and why I make things. And then the really beautiful picture above is a really good friend and collaborator, Ngozi. And 12 years later, I made this quite small banner for her, but a nice one that says, "Life is easy, love is free." And this was also something that I made for her after working together for a number of years on a project, Satelliser, a dance for the gallery. And it felt like something that would do her good to be reminded of and sort of have present in her domestic space. So friendly, colourful, textile, handmade, craft aesthetic, homeschooling. Great. This is what the inside of my sketchbooks and my mind sort of looks and feels like. So yeah, there's something about wanting to share with you guys like a kind of intimacy of processing. And for me, drawing is a really important part of how I imagine and vision the work that I'm making. And how it connects with audiences. So we'll go a little bit more towards audiences in a moment, but for now, yeah, I think it's always, for me, it's always a privilege to be in conversation with other artists and understand how they're thinking, conceiving of their works. And for me, I think really quite structurally, like in systems. And drawing helps me to externalize those and sort of understand what something might look like, the shape of it, sort of the order that things might run in. And that helps me to sort of deal with the different parts of what I might be making. So as you're going to see in a moment, the works have often lots of colour and sort of different sensory experiences around textile. Yeah, so we're going to get into all of it now. We might come back to these drawings later once you see sort of how they manifest. It's funny in a conversation that's so much about audiences to like feel so disconnected from you guys, but here we go. Okay, so here's another quite busy slide. I wanted to start us off with talking about the performing book, which is one of my earliest works from 2011, where I was thinking about the relationship between dancers and the public. So here you can see a kid here, little girl in this kind of patchwork dress, and then in the smaller picture at the side, you've got two kids there. And I was thinking about book structures and how my experience of performance up until this point had been mostly in theatres where you're in a kind of convention of sit down, face forward, experience something unfolding across a particular time. You have to know about the thing in advance. You have to buy your ticket already. You have to, even before that, I guess, be afforded the imaginational capacity to project yourself into the theatre space. You have to be able to get there, all of those things. And that's great and that's fine. But I was really interested in the relationship that readers have to book structures where we can pick things up and we can flip forwards and backwards. We can choose not to pick up a book. We can flip through very quickly. We can go at our own speed. We can go at our own pace. We might go backwards, etc. And I was looking a lot at book structures, and I was studying visual arts and thinking about different sort of not really performance conventions, but presentational conventions of dance, of visual arts and of book arts. And so I was asking myself the question, well, what if the audience or the visitor in a dance work could be positioned a bit like a reader of a book, where there's and now I always think there's a collaborative relationship between audiences and the work that they're seeing, and we'll come to that later. But what if the terms of engagement are really transparent, and where you might kind of just stumble across something. So for those who haven't seen it, you can find video of this online, some quite nice documentation. But basically, it's a row of dancers, each in a separate color, a little bit like Power Rangers. And each dancer has a phrase of movement, quite a short phrase. And the phrase runs kind of from, let's say, from A, B, C, D, E, and then also runs backwards. So if you, as an audience member, kind of walk in front of this line of movement, if you walk in one direction, the movement's going to run through its sequence A, B, C, D, E. And if you walk in the other direction, it's going to run E, D, C, B, A. Should have rehearsed that. If you come closer, it's going to kind of condense its volume. It's going to get smaller. And if you go further away, it's going to kind of expand. And these are really sort of intuitive operations. Like, we know just by being people in the world that we come maybe a little bit too close to someone, they're maybe going to back away or kind of reduce their space. And, you know, if we're, if someone's far away, we're probably going to adjust the space that we take up with our body to sort of greet them or welcome them. And so this is a really, it's an intuitive play between the audience or the readers who in a way like activate this dance. So it's a little bit like kind of like a sculpture. And as audience move around in front of the dancers, the way that the dance happens changes. It goes forwards, it goes back, it gets smaller, it gets bigger. And so it unfolds according to what I think of as like the coding of the dance. the choreography, it's fixed, but also in relationship to the desire of the audience member. Or often when it's adults and children, sometimes it's the desire of the adult to sort of push their child in and say, go on, have a go, play on that. And then later, maybe the adult will be brave enough to also have a go. And it becomes quite interesting after a little while, and as people start to understand the rules of engagement, they understand that if I go here, this happens. If I go here, this happens. How the movement modulates. It becomes sort of increasingly transparent as an encounter. Like we can understand through our own movement as audience, what the parameters are. And for me, this is really, really interesting in terms of access and accessibility. Which, you know, I won't say maybe masses about it now, but we'll come back to it later. But it's something about allowing the live kind of learning, unfolding, processing experience of each person to be met with this friendly, rigorous, resourced dancing that can work as well for a small child who's just kind of running up and down as it can for, I don't know, someone who finds that there's an analogy between this kind of work and maybe like computer programming, which is definitely in there. There's a sense in which it's kind of a program. And for me, so as neurodivergent, as autistic, another part of what I'm really interested in is how the works I make can sort of be taken apart in a way and put back together, or can sort of be understood in different ways. So I'm gonna move on to the next one because I'm sort of pick up ideas as we go. So the next work that I want to talk about is a work called The Human Clock, which is part of what I think of as Ronseal pieces, which is an advert from, I don't know, the 90s. It was a kind of a thing that you paint sheds with. So the tagline was, "It does what it says on the tin." Very accessible, great strapline. And the performing book and the human clock are really sort of similar in that way, that they're understandable, and the simplicity of the idea and the sort of first encounter through duration or through the audience staying a bit longer and exploring sort of gives way to sort of a depth of encounter. And so I'm gonna just skip, actually, no, just direct your attention for a moment. So you can see, so the clock, some of you might have seen this before. It's the image of a digital clock. It's an installation work. It runs durationally over time. It is just a clock. Like it does what it says it will do, which is that it's a clock run on the embodied time or the experience of time of the performer or the activator. So yeah, the image is like a digital clock, but its materials are analog, it's laminated paper, and it's kind of metal alloy frame. And we're pretty accurate. It's you maybe wouldn't set your watch by it, but we lose time and we gain time, but more or less it's accurate. And similarly to the performing book, like what I'm interested in this work is, and this is from 2013, so again, it's quite an old work, is how an image, in this case, the sort of changing image of time, reveals actually like both sort of, you can kind of unpack it. So down in the right-hand corner, you can see these are cutouts of the numbers that make up time, which are, you know, 0 to 9 and their order, and how that kind of inside of these books, these like packs of numbers, how they're the score of them. So the first pack being 0 to 2, the second pack being 0 to 9, and then the 2 points, and then 0 to 5, 0 to 9, etc. How us turning those in particular order is what actually sort of continually gives birth to this image of time, which also isn't time. Time is an unfolding experience. And so, yeah, one of the things this work does that's sort of similar to performing book in some ways is it allows people to access it on their own terms. And it's understandable by both a small child often, and also in this case, you see these two older women. And that depending on where you are in time, in age, and your relationship to not time as a sort of abstract idea, but sort of how you've lived your life, like your relationship to work, to labor, all of these things are what get kind of pulled into the encounter potentially. But it's also soft and it's also playful, and in some ways it's also just a changing image. But what it does is it, again, we've got all these complicated words, is that it often brings conversation. It often invites questions like, what are you doing? And then it sort of models somehow like the ongoing kind of movement of time, and it sort of allows people to be in a rhythmic relationship to something which can sometimes feel like I don't know, like it's just in a calendar, or it's just a set of deadlines. And yeah, it's quite a deceptively complex project in terms of what it brings up for people. And obviously it's repetitive. We've got some comments maybe. No, it's all good. It's just Christina. Perfect. So I'm going to take us on a little bit sort of further and deeper now. So this is a work from 2018, and it's a Screensaver Series. It's probably the work that I'm best known for. This is a dance and sound work that happens in sort of studio theatres, sometimes in gallery spaces. And it's a work which is similar in some ways, some similar this multi-partial, or like taking apart to put back together idea is present in the viewpoint. So at the bottom of these images, you can see this kind of kaleidoscopic kind of pattern stack of dancers creating these sort of morphing images, which if you look at some video, you'll kind of see in more detail. And that sort of front viewpoint, that's kind of this mesmeric kaleidoscope, is something which then, if you see from the side, gives way to revealing all of the labor that makes that work possible. So the kind of architecture. And there's lots and lots more to say about all of those things. But I think I just switch to this word of these lines again, because it sort of helps me to stay tethered to talking about audiences. This work, in a way, was, I guess, like a bit of a breakthrough for me in sort of entering into a theatre space with some of the ideas that I'd been busy with outside of the theatre, in terms of audience access and sort of conversation, or engaging with a work on your own terms, of coming and going, of sort of installation. And Screensaver is the first work that I made which has a dramaturgy. It has like a beginning and an end, although in many ways it is a sculpture. And it's working with a lot of ideas about what happens to the nervous system. So through touch, we are, those of us who dance it, we're in nearly constant touch relationship to each other. And we're kind of funneling all of our various kinds of contact with each other through this symmetrical pattern, which gives us a lot because it's limited. And in my experience, limitation is really, really useful as a device to welcome more than you could possibly imagine. And what it does, because we're moving through, I think some of you will know this work, and maybe you can see well enough sort of what happens without me describing loads, but it has this kind of ongoing birthing sort of quality as we disappear and reappear, as we move through patterns, a bit like Rorschach ink blots, etc., etc. And what that sets up in the space, in the performance space for audiences, in my experience, is first of all a kind of a desire to see from a particular viewpoint, which is normally the front. People sort of rush to get to the front. And there's a kind of wonder of sort of whose leg is what hand, how is this possible that they're sort of morphing and moving and going over and under each other. But then what tends to happen is there's a bit of can be a little bit of an unsettled moment as people sort of realize that maybe this is it, that it's kind of a one idea piece, which then tends to give way to a sort of a resettling, when actually you understand that this experience of attention that is allowing, it sort of feels like it's allowing a kind of rest that is also an active rest, which is also what we're practicing inside the work through touch. And so this work, it kind of came from an interest for me in my journey in relation to theatre and sort of theatre dance or concert dance, and a question of what developmentally appropriate opportunities there might be for me to make work, and what if I was ever offered a chance or could sort of imagine making work for the theatre conventions that I mentioned earlier, the kind of mostly sitting down, facing forward, something unfolding on stage, a way of making and presenting work, which has never really made sense to me. And thinking through that and thinking about the issues I talked about earlier, and a little bit about access and audience and visitors, I started to think a lot in this time as I was making this work around 2016 about neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and attention, about rhythm and repetition, about kind of a sensory architecture, about sort of therapeutic spaces with light and sound that sort of create a sense of activation, but that is a sort of safe activation, not like not a pull away from where you are, but a kind of play, maybe. I can't quite connect to the words right now, but so where I'm talking a lot and quickly, and the RBSL people are doing a really great job keeping up. And so, yeah, a lot of the other work I'd made was thinking about how pattern is important in relationship between visitors and the work. And this work, I think, took that slightly somewhere different in using my interest in pattern and cognition and dramaturgy and pattern recognition and camouflage into the visual culture of the work. So it's also work that I costumed, and you can see that these are costumes sourced from lots of different patterned sort of tops and leggings and leotards and things, which are different to each other, but also have what I think of as like a similar sort of bandwidth of pixelation or density of pattern, so that actually as we move, you can identify us sort of, or track us, and we can track each other through texture. But you also lose a bit sense of who's who and whose body is who. And so there was something about this kind of watching a dance, which is also a screensaver, which is both holding and occupying time, but which is not asking you to pay attention in a way that is maybe the same as something which is structured with like a beginning, middle, end, but can be a space maybe for going away in your mind and coming back, or maybe more restful attention. That was a lot about Screensaver. I'm going to just keep tracking through and have a sip of water. So this is a work from 2016/21. It kind of moves through the pandemic. It's Satelliser, a dance for the gallery. And I bring this work because it's doing something really particular in relation to some of the things we've already talked about around conversation, around kinds of participation. And yeah, so you can see we've got 3 images. The center image is J, who is in this image dancing. We're in the gallery. This is at Arnolfini in an exhibition about textile, a very beautiful exhibition about textile and the stories inside of textile. And then in the corner, the bottom left-hand corner, there's Christine Bramwell and Ngozi, who we met earlier. Ngozi's in the middle of talking. We see we've actually all got radio mics on, and Christine behind her is embroidering. And then on the right-hand side, we've got one of those embroidery hoops that is sort of happens within the project, but is also documentation of the project. So Christine is going to link to a podcast where I talk like a lot more extensively and probably a little bit more articulately about this project. But what I wanted to share with you is what I mentioned previously about sort of the main event and the fringe or the edges of a work, and Satelliser is one of 2 works that do this. So in Satelliser, there's a Satelliser dance for the gallery. It's quite a boring, repetitive dance, not a very interesting dance. The dance is in the convention of labor, which is work. So you also see we've got these high-vis vests on, which was my first sewing project. So homeschools. I taught myself to sew and made 16 of these guys. And so in over gallery hours, so durational, a group of collaborating artists we call co-workers. So in this case, Jay and Ngozi, Christine and me, there's also Mia in the back of that picture. We hold this dance, sometimes one of us dancing, sometimes 10 people dancing. We're on a shift pattern, we come and go. We are broadly identified as femme, non-binary people, and we're intergenerational. So the youngest person in this project, I think, was about 20, and the oldest was about 73. And whilst we're dancing, we're also talking. So if we think of like, yeah, that's a bit too much, isn't it? We think of if you think of like a blueprint, like a plan of a house or a building, so coming back to architectures, the dance is like at the bottom of the plan, like it's kind of like the blueprint, or I know we've got an architect on this call, so they're going to be able to say, give me a better analogy for this, but it's like the basic underlying structure is the dance, and it's ongoing and it has to always be there. You could also think of it maybe as the fabric of the embroidery, and then the gallery would be like the hoop, the embroidery hoop. And then the conversation, because the dance is so sort of stable and honestly like sort of boring, it allows the conversation that we're having with each other and with our visitors to travel in many directions, to change its tone, to change its direction, to change its subject matter. And so you see the dance. You might not always see the dance because in galleries we disappear and come back around installed objects. But you always hear the conversation through the PA system. And oh, running out of time. And the conversation is for me, I'm just going to skip through. I know this is too much, these images, but it's like a collage of all the different modalities of Satelliser. The conversation that's happening between these women is, I don't like the word normal, but I'm just going to say it's very normal conversation, in the sense that we laugh, we joke, sometimes we go to something really serious and difficult. Often there's silence because we just don't know how to resolve something that we're talking about. Yeah, and there's more to say about it, of course, but what it does for me and where it comes from is it models, we try to model a different way to be in conversation, a way to be in conversation about things that we maybe haven't spoken before, or to talk differently about familiar things, to not have the same old conversation that we always have, but to have a different kind of conversation. And so that also addresses our visitors, our audiences, and we're as curious about them as we are about each other. And they often join the dance, very often. There's a kid up here who has 2 kids actually who joined the dance, and people join the conversation all the time. And in a way, that participation over time for me kind of erodes the primacy of the dance and of us as co-workers, to the point where it doesn't happen, but the public could take over the work, and that would be beautiful. So we're going to pause in a moment for you guys to speak. But before we do that, I just trace through very, very briefly just a couple of images that I won't have time to talk about in a lot of detail. But this is another work, Storage for Future Sunsets, which has a longer history, and I know Hannah's, who's watching, might be keen to talk about it. But it was a commission with Scottish Dance Theatre for V&A Dundee, as inside of a kind of sculptural structure called Upsticks, and then we developed the work later, and I designed my own structure to house this work, which is a kind of a meeting house mushroom. Which again is a space for people to talk, for people to watch dance, for people to read, for people to draw, to people to rest, sleep, etc. So again, the main event and these fringes, and we don't have time for, and then we're back to sometimes, which again we don't have time for. And then just the last thing I wanted to leave you with before we sort of talk deeper, maybe between us, is so this is my godson Ali, when he came to visit me last year, and this is a puzzle that he and I were trying out, a puzzle of the Screensaver, and I just wanted to sort of leave here because I think making kind of what you might think of as merchandise, this is one of my posters, or postcards, is sort of a side activity, but for me it like kind of loops right back to what I was first talking about making things and spaces for yourself in order to have experiences, or for the people in your life to have experiences, as well as a sort of a professional, being a professional artist somehow. So yeah, I'm going to pause there because I know we have to open for conversation. Yeah, maybe I'll pause on this image because it's nice.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Neve. Neve, I wonder, do you think, what about it is a lovely image, but I wonder if it might be nice to see everyone as well now.
Oh yeah, great.
Yes, brilliant. And then I think anyone can go to gallery view, see everyone. Thank you so much, Neve. I have one of those little posters about the full experience, and I now really want one with the nobody gives a damn about what you don't do, which is such a great idea to live by. So this is now your opportunity to ask Neve anything, comment on what you've heard or seen. I've got a couple of questions whilst you have a think about yours. Neve, I was really enjoying hearing you talk about repetition and labour in the works, and I was thinking about repetition as it relates to rituals, and wondering if, in a sense, your work is offering rituals for today's society, and I wonder if you have thought about your work in that way, or what you feel the value of ritual is, or has it changed for us today?
Goodness, that's a really big question. I remember thinking about ritual last year when someone asked me something similar, and I remember thinking the answer was no, because I uh, I think my connection through my history and my background, like coming from a white working class background, and sort of, yeah, the way I grew up, is actually, I don't think ritual has been a big part of my life or my connection to making work. Um, I've always thought more about, yeah, like you said, about labor and about work. And I think maybe there's a connection there about like the rhythm of labor and work. But I think probably ritual is a space that gives back, or like a space for a kind of, what's the word? It begins with C. Some kind of communion with something and someone. Whereas I think my experience of repetition and of building spaces has been more about extraction, like emptying rather than filling, and not always in a positive way. So I think my interest in that kind of exchange is maybe that's probably why I'm interested in conversation. But having said that, there's a lot of religious imagery in sometimes, which has been really surprising to me that that's kind of come out. So I'm not really answering your question, I'm sorry.
No, you absolutely are. And I also picked up the phrase you use, repetition as a way of deepening an encounter, which I thought was really great way of talking about or framing the power of repetition in work.
Yeah, and I think I also, because of how I process information, I do repeat a lot. And I don't know if it's ritualized. I don't think it's ritualized. I think it is something else. Um, but yeah, I think I'm interested in rhythm of things, and sort of repetition and change as a way to understand. Yeah.
We've got a question comment in the chat from Anna. Could you talk a little more about how you practice rest through touch in Screensaver?
Yeah, so I mean, I probably should have prefaced this talk with like a bit more information about the audience somehow, and each other, and how that includes also the people we work with. But something something that I keep returning to, that came up from some writing I did about the screensaver some years ago, was this phrase, contact makes each other possible, and that we make each other up. And so I have a long answer, but a short answer is, in relation to the shaping of the nervous system, and from reflex into sort of patterns of understanding, say, between like an infant and caregivers, and then how we can sort of think about touch and sort of meeting needs, and sort of limiting in a positive way, containing, shaping experience through touch as some of the first experiences that any of us ever had, and how touch in the screensaver practice is in many ways tapping into some of that, like quite deep history. And so you know, touch, I think touch is like so important, and not all of us have a lot of touch for various sort of reasons. And in the screen, like you can go into a screensaver rehearsal and just feel like horrible. You can feel like agitated and tired or whatever. and like maybe it's going to be a bit difficult to like dance with people. And then we start to get into the practice, and it involves different kinds of touch which activate not just like on the skin, not like stroking, but this kind of deeper touch which isn't massage, but which is received by the body in a way that sort of lets you know where you are, that gives you a sort of quite grounded reference point, but also makes a lot of things possible. It's possible for my body to do things in relation to other bodies that I can't do alone. That when you then come out of the other end of that rehearsal, often we're sort of in a kind of a high, we've gone through an experience together. And whilst our audience don't have that same experience, I think there is a transmission of that in in the space. That was my trying to be short answer, Anna, to your question.
Thanks, Neve. If you have any more questions, do pop them in the chat or use the raise hand function. I had a question, Neve, about you mentioned quite near the beginning about your practice being somehow about partnering with different parts of yourself. And it seemed to me that might also be the case for your audiences. And I wonder if that is indeed the experience or the feedback that you get, or what you're offering or inviting your audiences to feel in the work.
Yeah, I think so. So I made a commitment a few years ago to try to sort of unmask in a way which is sort of related to being autistic, and trying to commit more deeply to sort of like the truth in a way of like how I process and be resourced from that place, as well as challenged by it. And I say that in relation to your question because the audiences of sometimes, so many people afterwards, people who don't know me, were like, oh, I feel like I was inside your brain. I was like, that's interesting, because like you don't know what my brain is like, but I think something of the weirdness of that journey, which I know we didn't talk about sometimes, but if Screensaver is an autistic work in the sense that it's one idea faithfully like pursued, sometimes is a much bigger work. It passes through many different scenes. It's 90 minutes. The audience are in the round, stage design, light, sound, conversation, a folk dance, a dance of tectonic plates. It is a work in which I connect, I think, to sort of a lot of different parts of my making and self, and through which I've learned a lot also. This is how I function in the world. I don't know how I could be if not, I could only really be an artist. I think I said the word citizen earlier, and I think that's important. So I could talk more, but there's a question from Bianca. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. I think maybe my question just adds on this, and I'm trying to collect my thoughts. You talked about how do people enter the space, and I'm wondering how do people leave the space, and what happens in between. And you were talking also about the reveal of the code of the performance. And I was thinking about, when we are talking about rhythm and repetition, that also a few patterns might appear in the performance, also in the way that it transforms maybe. And maybe transformation is also a word I would like to bring in. Like, is there any transformation, maybe with even a wish to transform happening in the performance? So yeah, how do people enter, and how do people leave, and what happens in between? And I'm also asking, coming from a research on social choreography. And I really can see some similarities, and this is where my curiosity is coming from.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's a great set of questions, and it's definitely I think those are some of the questions that I'll be busy with you know, for the rest of my life and have been busy with. I think I maybe can't answer all of them in the time we have, but transformation, yeah. So I think one thing that, you know, is things I haven't talked about, and I had all those sort of diagrammatic drawings at the beginning, and there's not time to go into everything, but something that I think a lot about is sort of the notation of the experience of the audience, whether it's like in the perform book, it's a line, it's like a one-on-one encounter, but then is multiplied by the line of dancers. So it's quite simple in a way. In other words, it's more like a grid, has more depth. In Satelliser, it's a spiral, and the spiral is really important when we think about dramaturgy, which is sort of how things unfold in time. And probably in relation to Christina's question about ritual, which is that if I approach you like directly, it can be quite startling. But if I approach on a spiral, then you have chance to see me from different angles, to know something about me as I approach. And this is like really deeply known in like many indigenous forms of ritual and performance. Like this is not new knowledge and it's not my knowledge. But I think it's lacking in like my history, let's say, and where I've sort of come from in you know, in thinking about conversation as like a sort of defensive, abrupt meeting between people. And instead, if we can meet on a spiral, which is to say that as a visitor, you have time to see what's happening for a long time before you choose to enter or before you're addressed by something, then your journey into the work and therefore with the work, if you can stay, and people do stay, is a sort of, it, you know, only really those visitors can speak about their experience, but it does mean that it's kind of like having more surface area for an encounter. And there's like a lot more to say about it, but I think that can be transformative. And I think we can continue this conversation in like other forms and formats, like beyond this talk, because I think, Bianca, probably you and I would have things to say to each other about social choreography, for sure. I'm not really answering you because we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Thanks, Bianca, for your question. Thanks, Neve. Yes, sadly, I think we are going to have to wrap up for this afternoon. So I want to give a really huge thanks to Neve for today's session, and to Lauren and Caroline for interpreting, and to you all for coming this afternoon. So we're coming to the end of our webinar series, but there is one more next week, 12th of June, which is Holding Dance, Caring for Our Ecology, with Temitope Ajosi, Grace Nicol, Katie Coe, and Thomas Goodwin. So do come along for the last in the series then. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Super cool.